Look at a price tag in a modern supermarket, and the explanation seems obvious. Governments print money, money loses value, and everything becomes more expensive. That story contains an important truth, but it begins far too late. Inflation existed centuries before the paper banknotes, central banks, or electronic credit. Long before Monnaie content reference always cite zero, index zero. The currency allowed them to command resources without announcing a new tax. The first inflation machines were not hidden inside modern banks. They stood in ancient mints where furnaces melted silver workers struck coins, and imperial officials decided how much precious metal each piece of money would contain. Yet even here, the familiar explanation is incomplete. Reducing the silver in a coin did not automatically raise every price by the same amount. To understand why, we must first understand what ancient money actually was. A Roman coin possessed three different kinds of value. It contained metal that could be weighed. It carried a legal denomination declared by the state. And it had a political value because the government accepted it for taxes, fines, and official payments. Those values could move together, but they did not have to. A merchant receiving unfamiliar coins might inspect their color, weight, and surface. A tax collector might accept the same coins at their official value because the emperor commanded it. A soldier might spend them without asking how much silver lay beneath the portrait stamped on the front. Money, therefore, depended on more than metal. It depended on habit, law, taxation, and confidence. As long as people believed that others would continue accepting the coin, a reduction in its silver content could remain partly concealed. The coin still looked like money. The state still called it money, and for a time the economy continued treating it as money. The pressure behind this system was not mysterious. The Roman Empire had borders to defend, roads to maintain, grain shipments to organize, officials to pay, and armies whose loyalty could determine whether an emperor remained alive. Taxes supplied resources, but taxation was slow, politically dangerous, and uneven across an enormous territory. Military emergencies did not wait for a new census or a successful harvest. When an emperor needed more coins than the treasury possessed, the mint offered a tempting solution. Silver coins could be recalled melted, mixed with a larger quantity of cheaper metal, and restruck into a greater number of new coins. The empire had not discovered how to create silver. It had discovered how to create additional monetary claims from the same reserve of silver. More soldiers could be paid, more supplies could be purchased, and more obligations could be met before the public fully understood that each coin contained less of the material that had once supported its value. This was debasement, but debasement alone was not inflation. If commerce was expanding, if more regions were beginning to use coins, or if goods and services were increasing alongside the money supply, additional currency could circulate without producing an immediate explosion in prices. The Roman economy was not one integrated market with a single price index. Conditions in Egypt could differ from conditions in Italy, Gaul, or the eastern provinces. Taxes could preserve demand for official coins even when their metal content declined. Old coins could remain in circulation beside new ones. Credit and payments in kind could reduce dependence on cash. This is why the history of Roman inflation cannot be reduced to a chart showing less silver and higher prices. The metal mattered, but so did the amount of commerce, the supply of goods, the needs of the state, and the public's willingness to continue treating the emperor's promise as credible. The relationship became far more dangerous during the 3rd century when the monetary problem merged with a political and military crisis. Emperors rose and fell rapidly. Rival claimants needed armies, and armies demanded payment. Invasions and civil wars disrupted production and transport. Local officials faced uncertain authority. The state issued large quantities of increasingly altered coinage, while the goods available for those coins became harder to produce and move. Each pressure reinforced the next. Military instability increased spending. Increased spending encouraged further coin production. Weaker coins and political uncertainty reduced confidence. Merchants demanded more money or avoided transactions they considered too risky. Higher prices increased the government's own expenses, creating pressure for still more currency. The empire was not suffering from one isolated monetary mistake. It was trapped inside a feedback loop in which fiscal weakness, military competition, reduced production, and declining trust turned against one another. By the time Emperor Diocletian attempted to restore order, the problem could no longer be solved by changing the image stamped on a coin. He reorganized taxation, reformed the currency, and in the year 301 issued an extraordinary decree setting maximum prices for a vast range of goods, services, and wages. The logic appeared reasonable. If sellers were charging more, the government would forbid them from doing so. But a legal ceiling could not create grain, repair transport routes, restore a coin's credibility, or eliminate the risks merchants faced. When the official price failed to cover the cost of bringing goods to market, sellers could withdraw, conceal supplies, or trade outside legal channels. The edict revealed an enduring feature of inflationary politics. Authorities often treat the visible price as the problem, because it is easier to command a number than to repair the system producing it. For ordinary people, the crisis was experienced through unequal adjustment. A soldier receiving newly issued coins might initially believe his pay had increased, only to discover that food and clothing required more of them. A merchant could protect himself by changing prices quickly or demanding payment in more trusted forms. A wealthy landowner could hold grain property or other physical assets. A laborer paid according to custom had fewer defenses. Wages were negotiated slowly. Hunger arrived quickly. The state's monetary solution therefore redistributed the cost of imperial survival. It allowed the government to spend before collecting equivalent resources through taxation, but it reduced the real value of money already held by others. The result resembled a tax, though no law announced its rate, and no collector appeared at the door. The payment was extracted through the declining quantity of goods that the same number of coins could buy. Rome demonstrated that metal money could be manipulated, but the next great inflation did not begin inside a European mint. It began inside a mountain in the Andes. In the middle of the 16th century, enormous silver deposits at Potosí, in what is now Bolivia, were drawn into the expanding Spanish imperial system. The mountain, known as Cerro Rico, became a landscape of shafts, furnaces, mills, animals, officials, merchants, and coerced indigenous labor. Silver ore was extracted at immense human cost, processed, taxed, and converted into bars and coins. What appeared in Europe as monetary abundance began as physical labor in a harsh colonial environment. The silver did not simply materialize in royal vaults. It passed through a chain of conquest, compulsory labor, private investment, imperial administration, refining technology, transportation, and maritime risk. From American ports, bullion crossed the Atlantic under armed protection. Some entered the Spanish treasury. Some paid merchants, contractors, soldiers, and lenders. Some flowed toward creditors who had financed the monarchy's wars. Much of it continued through European and Mediterranean trade, while additional streams crossed the Pacific and entered Asian markets where demand for silver was strong. The result was not merely that Spain became richer. Europe and much of the wider commercial world received a growing supply of the metal used to settle debts and measure value. A silver coin was still silver, but silver itself was becoming less scarce relative to the goods people wanted to purchase. The empire that controlled the mines could spend more, yet the purchasing power of each unit of silver could decline as the global stock expanded. The scale of the change was extraordinary by pre-industrial standards. From the beginning of the 16th century to the middle of the 17th, prices measured in silver more than doubled across much of Europe and rose by more than 200% in some countries. In currencies also affected by debasement, the nominal increases could be far greater. This was not a sudden burst lasting a few months. It unfolded across generations. A person could be born into one structure of rents, wages, and food prices and die in a world where the same quantities of money bought far less. Because the increase was gradual, institutions adjusted unevenly. Some contracts remained fixed, others were renegotiated. Governments collected larger nominal revenues but also faced higher costs. The price revolution did not destroy money in the spectacular manner of a later hyperinflation. It altered the balance of power quietly, persistently, and unequally. In the 20th century, economic historian Earl J. Hamilton gave this transformation its most influential monetary explanation. By comparing records of American treasure imports with prices in Spain, he argued that the arrival of gold, and especially silver, played a central role in the long inflation. The mechanism was powerful and concrete. A larger monetary stock enabled more spending. If the production of food, cloth, housing, and other goods failed to expand at the same pace, sellers could demand more money for the same output. Hamilton's work helped turn shipping records, customs accounts, wage books, and price lists into evidence for economic history. It also encouraged a simple story: American silver entered Europe, and European prices rose. But the timing and geography of the price revolution made that explanation incomplete. In some areas, prices were already moving before the largest American inflows arrived, and the same amount of silver did not produce identical results everywhere. Europe's population was recovering after the demographic disasters of the late Middle Ages. More people required grain housing, fuel, clothing, and land. Agricultural production could grow, but not always quickly enough to meet demand. Towns expanded. Markets deepened. Credit became more important. Governments raised armies and competed for resources. Silver moved faster through increasingly connected commercial networks. These changes did not disprove the monetary explanation. They revealed the machinery through which it operated. New money had a greater inflationary effect when it entered an economy already facing rising demand and limited supply. Population growth increased pressure on food. Urbanization increased the number of cash transactions. Credit allowed spending to expand beyond the coins physically present. War redirected labor and production toward the state. Silver was not acting alone. It was entering a system whose capacity to create claims was expanding faster than its capacity to produce essential goods. The consequences depended on where each person stood inside that system. Debtors could benefit because they repaid old obligations with money that purchased less than when the debt was created. Creditors receiving fixed payments could lose. Landlords who adjusted rents could protect their income, while those tied to long leases watched its real value erode. Merchants positioned between distant markets could profit from changing prices and exchange rates. Wage earners often suffered because food prices could rise faster than pay. Governments gained a temporary ability to spend more nominal money, but they also discovered that soldiers, contractors, and officials eventually demanded compensation for the currency's weakening value. Inflation did not make society uniformly poorer at the same moment. It changed contracts, shifted wealth, and moved political power between groups that adjusted at different speeds. The first inflation machines therefore reveal something deeper than the old slogan about too much money. A Roman emperor reduced the metal inside a coin because the army had to be paid before taxes could be collected. A colonial empire extracted silver because global power required fleets, creditors, and military campaigns. Merchants raised prices because the money arriving in their markets was increasing faster than some of the goods available for sale. Workers suffered because their wages did not move as quickly as the cost of bread. Inflation emerged from the gap between promises and production, but it also became a method for deciding who would absorb that gap. Metal placed limits on rulers, yet those limits were never absolute. As European wars grew larger and states became more ambitious, even the mountains of the Americas could not supply money quickly enough. The next instrument would not need to be mined, melted, or hammered into shape. It would be printed as a promise. Paper money was not merely a new kind of currency, it was a new kind of political promise. A metal coin required ore, labor, transport, and time. A paper note required ink authority and public belief. That difference gave governments an extraordinary power. They could spend resources that taxation had not yet collected, and that borrowing might not otherwise provide. But every note carried an unstated condition. The state would not issue so many promises that the promise itself became worthless. During peace, that discipline could appear manageable. During revolution and war, it became much harder. Armies needed food immediately. Suppliers wanted payment immediately. Citizens resisted new taxes immediately. Paper allowed governments to delay the visible sacrifice. The danger was that the sacrifice did not disappear. It returned later through higher prices, depreciating wages, broken contracts, and the destruction of savings. Revolutionary France offered one of the clearest early demonstrations. In 1789, the new government inherited a fiscal crisis that the revolution had not solved. It possessed enormous quantities of nationalized church property, but land could not be divided quickly enough to pay officials, purchase grain, or finance political transformation. The solution was the assignat, originally conceived as an interest-bearing claim connected to the sale of confiscated property. On paper, the instrument appeared secure. France had land. The notes represented that land. As the property was sold, the assignats could be retired. But the government soon discovered that the notes were more useful as circulating money than as temporary financial certificates. Additional issues paid creditors and supported public expenditure. Each new issue answered an urgent need. Together, they expanded the quantity of claims far beyond the system's ability to redeem them without destroying confidence. The assignat did not collapse because paper was inherently fraudulent. It collapsed because the political system repeatedly used issuance to avoid choices it could not resolve. War disrupted trade and production. Harvest conditions affected food supplies. Counterfeiting weakened trust. Political violence made property values uncertain. The government needed to support armies, cities, and an unstable administration, while its capacity to collect regular taxes remained weak. As prices rose and the notes lost purchasing power, authorities printed more because every government expense now required a larger number of assignats. The additional currency then placed still more pressure on prices and exchange rates. France attempted to control the visible symptoms through compulsory acceptance and maximum price laws. But a decree could not force a farmer to release grain at a price that no longer covered the risk of bringing it to market. Official prices survived on paper. Scarcity moved into queues, concealment, barter, and illegal trade. Across the English Channel, Britain confronted the same revolutionary and Napoleonic wars without experiencing the same monetary destruction. In 1797, pressure on the Bank of England's gold reserves led Parliament to suspend the conversion of banknotes into gold. Smaller notes entered wider circulation, and critics warned that paper would become worthless. Prices did rise during the Long War, and the pound traded below its former gold value. Yet Britain did not descend into revolutionary hyperinflation. The difference was not moral superiority or magical banking technique. The British state possessed deeper credit markets, a stronger capacity to collect taxes, and a political system able to borrow vast sums from investors who believed that future revenue would service the debt. Suspension created flexibility, but it operated inside an institutional structure that retained enough credibility to make eventual restoration believable. The contrast revealed a central rule of paper money. The quantity of notes matters, but so does the institution standing behind them. A government that can tax, borrow, and eventually reduce emergency spending may issue paper without destroying the currency. A government that must continually create money because no credible source of future revenue exists faces a different path. Britain spread the cost of war across present taxpayers, bondholders, and future generations. Revolutionary France increasingly concentrated the burden inside the currency itself. Neither system made war free, they distributed its costs differently. One relied more heavily on explicit taxes and long-term debt. The other relied more heavily on money whose value deteriorated before the political system could construct a stable fiscal foundation. The American Civil War provided another version of the same experiment. In 1862, the United States government authorized paper notes known as greenbacks legal tender that was not directly redeemable in gold or silver. The Union needed soldiers, rail transport, weapons, uniforms, and food on a scale that existing tax revenues could not cover. The notes expanded federal purchasing power and contributed to wartime inflation. Their value moved with military events and expectations about the government's survival. Yet the greenback did not become worthless. The Union possessed a large productive economy, imposed new taxes, borrowed heavily, and ultimately won the war. The paper currency depreciated, but the state behind it survived with its tax base and political authority intact. Again, money creation mattered, but the final value of the promise depended on whether the issuing government could eventually make its obligations credible. By 1914, war finance had become industrial. Governments were no longer purchasing muskets, horses, and modest quantities of grain. They were mobilizing millions of men while consuming coal, steel, chemicals, ships, railway capacity, artillery shells, and entire harvests. No major belligerent could finance such a struggle through ordinary peacetime taxes alone. Governments raised taxes, sold war bonds, borrowed abroad, suspended normal gold constraints, and relied on central banks to support financial markets and public debt. The choice of financing determined who paid first. Taxes reduced civilian purchasing power immediately. Bonds transferred part of the cost into the future. Monetary expansion allowed governments to compete for labor and materials, without removing an equal amount of private demand at once. The result was predictable: more money and government purchasing power pursued a civilian supply already restricted by mobilization. Price controls and rationing concealed part of this wartime inflation. A government could forbid the price of bread from rising, but it could not guarantee that every shop would have bread. It could restrict rent increases, regulate wages, and allocate fuel. Yet these measures shifted pressure rather than eliminating it. Official price indices recorded controlled transactions, while households experienced queues, declining quality substitution, and shortages. War bonds also disguised the burden. Citizens were told they were lending to the nation, and many believed they were preserving wealth while supporting victory. But after the war, inflation could reduce the real value of what the government repaid. The bond remained numerically intact. Its purchasing power did not. Wartime finance therefore linked patriotism debt and monetary depreciation in a system whose full cost became visible only after the fighting stopped. Germany entered the post-war era with that system already under strain. The imperial government had financed much of the war through borrowing, partly because leaders expected victory and indemnities to settle the bill. Defeat destroyed that expectation. The new republic inherited war debt pensions, demobilization costs, social conflict, and a weakened capacity to tax a society exhausted by war and blockade. It also faced reparations imposed by the victorious powers' territorial losses, political violence, and uncertainty over the scale and timing of external payments. The popular explanation says Versailles printed the German banknotes. It did not. But the reparations conflict damaged confidence, created demands for foreign currency, and intensified doubts about whether the German state could ever align its obligations with its resources. This is where historians divide the emphasis. One interpretation places the central burden on the peace settlement. Germany had to obtain foreign exchange to meet external obligations, while uncertainty surrounding reparations weakened the mark and discouraged confidence. John Maynard Keynes became the most famous early critic of a settlement he believed imposed demands that could destabilize Europe. A competing interpretation emphasizes domestic choices. German governments resisted taxation sufficient to cover expenditures, supported public services and employment, protected influential economic groups, and financed deficits through short-term obligations absorbed by the Reichsbank. Reparations were not imaginary, but neither were they the only reason the budget remained unbalanced. The stronger explanation combines the two. External demands narrowed Germany's options, while domestic political conflict made the remaining options harder to use. The inflation then became a self-reinforcing system. The government spent more than it collected and issued treasury bills. The Reichsbank converted those bills into money. The expanding currency weakened against foreign currencies. Germany needed foreign exchange to purchase imported food, fuel, and raw materials, so depreciation raised domestic costs. Workers demanded higher wages because prices had increased. Government employees, pensioners, and suppliers required larger nominal payments. Tax revenue arrived with delays, meaning inflation reduced its value before the Treasury could spend it. The government therefore faced still larger deficits and issued still more obligations. Money creation was causing inflation, but it was also responding to expenses that inflation itself had enlarged. By the summer of 1922, price increases had reached rates economists classify as hyperinflation. Confidence no longer eroded gradually. People began reorganizing daily life around the expectation that the mark would be worth less tomorrow. The occupation of the Ruhr in January 1923 transformed an existing disaster into a final collapse. French and Belgian forces entered Germany's industrial heartland after disputes over reparations deliveries. The German government answered with passive resistance, encouraging workers to refuse cooperation while promising to support their wages and businesses. Production fell in a region vital to coal and industry. Tax revenue weakened. Public expenditure expanded. The state financed the campaign through the Reichsbank, creating money to pay people not to produce under occupation. Politically, the policy expressed national resistance. Economically, it combined lower output with higher monetary spending. The government was defending sovereignty through a mechanism that accelerated the destruction of its currency. What appeared rational within the confrontation became catastrophic within the monetary system. Hyperinflation changed the meaning of time. A monthly salary was no longer a reliable unit of household planning. Employers paid workers more frequently because waiting could destroy the value of wages. Shopkeepers adjusted prices repeatedly, not necessarily because they were becoming richer, but because replacement stock might cost far more than the goods they had just sold. Families moved from cash into food, coal, foreign currency, jewelry, or anything expected to preserve value. Debtors could eliminate old obligations with depreciated money, while creditors received repayment stripped of purchasing power. People dependent on pensions or accumulated savings had fewer defenses. Their accounts might still contain impressive numbers, but the numbers no longer commanded food, heat, or security. Inflation had ceased to be an increase in prices. It had become the collapse of the contract connecting past work to future consumption. The winners were not as simple as later legends suggested. Some industrial firms gained temporary advantages from cheap credit and the erosion of debt. Exporters could benefit from a weak currency until shortages and disruption overwhelmed production. Owners of physical assets were often better protected than holders of cash. But rapidly changing prices also destroyed working capital, distorted accounting, and made ordinary business calculation nearly impossible. Workers could bargain for wage increases and still lose between one payment and the next. Farmers possessing food held something more stable than paper. Yet they also faced controls, taxation, and difficulties obtaining industrial goods. Hyperinflation did not transfer wealth neatly from one class to another. It rewarded proximity to real assets, foreign currency credit, and rapid information, while punishing fixed claims, delayed payments, and trust in long-term contracts. The collapse ended only when the political and fiscal regime changed. Passive resistance in the Ruhr was abandoned. Government spending was cut, taxation was reorganized, and uncontrolled financing through the Reichsbank was restricted. A new monetary unit, the Rentenmark, was introduced with a carefully limited supply and a framework designed to restore confidence. It was not a magical piece of paper. Germany had already printed pieces of paper containing enormous denominations. The difference was the belief that the new notes would not be created to finance the old pattern of unlimited deficits. Stabilization required a currency, but it also required a government capable of making the currency's promise credible. Afterward, the memory of ruined savings would shape German political culture for generations. The age of paper money had revealed both its power and its danger. It allowed states to survive revolutions, civil wars, and industrial conflict without first collecting every resource through taxation. It also allowed political leaders to postpone decisions until the currency became the battlefield on which those decisions were settled. Yet the lesson of 1923 was not that all paper money must end in catastrophe. Britain's wartime notes had survived. The greenback had survived. The decisive question was whether monetary expansion remained connected to a credible fiscal system and a productive economy. After the Second World War, governments would try to build institutions capable of managing that connection. They would promise employment growth, social security, and monetary stability at the same time. Inflation would no longer appear mainly as the breakdown of money. It would become a permanent variable to be managed. The modern age of inflation began with a promise that earlier monetary systems had repeatedly failed to keep. After depression, fascism, and global war, governments believed they could build institutions strong enough to preserve employment growth and stable money entirely on the accidental discovery of silver or the rigid discipline of a classical gold standard. Economists would measure demand. Finance ministries would manage budgets. Central banks would adjust credit before panic became catastrophe. Factories would remain open, workers would remain employed, and currencies would remain trustworthy. It was an ambitious settlement, shaped by the memory of mass unemployment in the 1930s and by the fear that economic collapse could destroy democracy itself. But the new system contained a tension that no conference could eliminate. Governments wanted the freedom to support their domestic economies, while the international monetary order still required them to defend fixed values for their currencies. That compromise was constructed at Bretton Woods in 1944. Most participating countries fixed their currencies to the United States dollar, while the United States promised to exchange dollars held by foreign monetary authorities for gold at $35 an ounce. Gold remained in the system, but the dollar now stood between gold and much of the world economy. This arrangement reflected American industrial and financial dominance at the end of the war. The United States possessed enormous productive capacity and a large share of the world's monetary gold. Dollars were needed to purchase American machinery, food, fuel, and technology. Yet the system depended on a contradiction. The world needed a growing supply of dollars to finance trade and reconstruction, but every dollar sent abroad became a potential claim on a limited American gold reserve. The more successfully the dollar served the world, the harder it became to guarantee that every official holder could exchange it at the promised price. For a time, post-war growth concealed the problem. Factories converted from military production to consumer goods. Banks expanded mortgages and business loans. Highways, suburbs, automobiles, appliances, and expanding public programs created a sense that modern institutions had finally learned how to manage prosperity. Governments also adopted a broader responsibility for employment. The political memory of the Great Depression made prolonged unemployment appear not merely unfortunate but unacceptable. Economic policy would no longer wait passively for wages and prices to adjust through recession. Fiscal spending and monetary policy would support demand when private investment weakened. This was a profound moral and political shift. It reduced the willingness of governments to allow deflation to liquidate debts and force prices downward. But it also created pressure to stimulate the economy whenever growth slowed, even when the available productive capacity was already under strain. The intellectual tool that appeared to make this manageable was the Phillips curve. Economists observed a relationship between unemployment and wage or price inflation, and increasingly treated it as a menu of policy choices. A government might accept slightly higher inflation in exchange for lower unemployment. To leaders haunted by the 1930s, this seemed reasonable. Unemployment closed factories, destroyed income, and threatened political stability. Modest inflation appeared less visible and less immediate. But Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps warned that the trade-off would not remain stable. Workers, businesses, and lenders would learn. Once they expected prices to rise, they would build that expectation into wages, contracts, interest rates, and markups. Additional demand might lower unemployment briefly, but eventually the economy would inherit both higher inflation and no permanent improvement in employment. The policy could work only while people failed to understand the policy. Political incentives made that warning easy to ignore. Tightening credit could raise unemployment before it reduced inflation. The factory closure appeared immediately. The improvement in monetary credibility arrived later and could not easily be photographed. Elected governments wanted expansion before elections and feared recessions that might be blamed on deliberate policy. Central bankers worried about employment, financial markets, and government borrowing costs. Each individual decision to delay restraint could appear defensible. A temporary stimulus might protect jobs. A gradual approach might avoid panic. A small increase in inflation might seem tolerable. But repeated decisions of this kind changed expectations. Businesses learned that authorities would retreat when unemployment rose. Workers learned to demand wage increases before prices overtook them. Investors demanded higher interest rates as protection against future depreciation. Inflation was becoming not simply a policy outcome, but an assumption embedded in the economy's contracts. By the late 1960s, the international and domestic promises surrounding the dollar were becoming harder to reconcile. The United States financed military commitments abroad, including the war in Vietnam, while expanding domestic spending at home. Private credit and government demand increased. Dollars accumulated outside the country while foreign monetary authorities retained the right to request American gold. Raising interest rates and restraining demand might have protected the dollar, but it threatened employment and growth. Devaluation might have relieved pressure, but it would have admitted that the anchor of the system could not maintain its promised value. The United States had supplied the world with liquidity, and that liquidity had become a claim against the United States. Bretton Woods had not failed because gold suddenly disappeared. It failed because the political cost of defending the gold commitment became greater than the political cost of abandoning it. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended official conversion of dollars into gold. He also announced wage and price controls intended to restrain inflation without imposing a severe recession. The measures were politically dramatic and temporarily popular. Closing the gold window removed the immediate threat that foreign claims would drain American reserves. Controls made prices appear stable by limiting what businesses could legally charge. But neither action resolved the underlying imbalance between demand production credit and expectations. Controls could delay price changes just as wartime controls had done before. They could not guarantee that supply would expand or that costs would stop rising. When controls were relaxed, accumulated pressure could reappear. And without the external gold constraint, monetary discipline depended increasingly on the judgment and credibility of institutions, whose leaders faced strong pressure to preserve employment and growth. Then came the oil shocks, the most visible symbol of the inflationary 1970s. Oil prices rose sharply, gasoline lines appeared, transportation costs increased, and factories confronted more expensive energy. These were genuine supply shocks. They reduced what economies could produce at existing costs and forced households to spend more on fuel. But oil alone cannot explain why inflation remained high for years. A one-time increase in the price of energy can raise the price level. Continuing inflation requires the broader system to accommodate and reproduce that increase. Workers seek higher wages to recover lost purchasing power. Businesses raise prices to cover wages and materials. Governments support demand to prevent unemployment. Central banks create enough monetary growth to stop the struggle from ending in immediate recession. The original shock moves through contracts and expectations until it becomes a general process rather than a change in one commodity. This is why the Great Inflation produced competing interpretations that remain politically powerful. Monetarists emphasize that inflation could not have persisted without excessive monetary growth. Supply-centered explanations stress oil food shortages, declining productivity, and disruptions in the world economy. Fiscal interpretations point to government commitments that were not fully matched by taxes. Institutional accounts emphasize political pressure and the reluctance of central banks to accept unemployment. Intellectual histories focus on faulty models, especially the belief that policymakers could permanently trade higher inflation for more jobs. Each explanation contains evidence. None is sufficient alone. Supply shocks explain why pressure intensified at particular moments. Fiscal and political commitments explain why restraint was difficult. Monetary accommodation explains how temporary price increases became sustained inflation. Expectations explain why stopping the process became more expensive with every year of delay. Arthur Burns, who became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1970, has often been cast as the central villain of the episode. But that interpretation is too convenient. Burns believed much of the inflation came from forces that interest rates could not directly repair, including unions, food prices, energy shortages, and corporate pricing. Raising rates could not produce oil or harvest grain. It could, however, close factories and increase unemployment. The reasoning was not irrational. The problem was that monetary policy repeatedly accommodated pressures it could not cure. The Federal Reserve tightened, unemployment rose, and policy eased before inflationary expectations had been fully broken. This stop-and-go pattern taught the public that restraint would not last. A temporary slowdown became an opportunity to prepare for the next round of price increases, rather than evidence that the monetary regime had changed. By 1980, American inflation had climbed above 14%. A dollar was not becoming worthless in the manner of the German mark in 1923, but confidence in long-term contracts was deteriorating. Workers demanded cost-of-living adjustments. Lenders charged higher interest rates because repayment would arrive in less valuable money. Businesses struggled to distinguish a real change in demand from a general change in prices. Households moved purchases forward because waiting could mean paying more. Inflation accelerated economic time. Money had to be spent, wages renegotiated, inventories replaced, and loans repriced more quickly. The system remained functional, yet every contract contained an argument over whose forecast of inflation would prove correct. The higher expectations rose, the more expensive it became to prove them wrong. Paul Volcker arrived at the Federal Reserve in 1979 with a different diagnosis. Inflation was not merely one problem among many. It was undermining the institution's ability to manage every other problem. In October, the Federal Reserve shifted its operating approach toward tighter control of bank reserves and monetary growth, allowing interest rates to fluctuate much more sharply. The federal funds rate eventually approached 20%. Borrowing became painfully expensive. Mortgage markets contracted. Construction slowed. Manufacturers dependent on credit and durable goods demand lost orders. Farmers carrying debt faced interest costs they could not easily meet. The policy worked not because high rates physically produced oil or food, but because they reduced spending, weakened wage and price pressure, and demonstrated that the central bank would no longer reverse course at the first sign of economic pain. That pain was severe. The economy entered a deep recession in 1981, and unemployment reached 10.8% near the end of 1982. Behind that number were closed assembly lines, unfinished houses, insolvent businesses, farm auctions, and families whose incomes disappeared while their debts remained. Disinflation was not a technical adjustment performed in a sealed meeting room. It was a transfer of the cost of restoring credibility onto workers' borrowers' firms and communities most exposed to high interest rates. Volcker's defenders argued that delaying the reckoning would have produced an even greater crisis later. His critics argued that the burden was distributed brutally and unequally. Both points can be true. Inflation had imposed a hidden and accumulating cost. Stopping it imposed a visible and immediate one. By the end of the recession, inflation had fallen below 5%, and the expectation of endless acceleration began to weaken. The victory changed central banking. Price stability was no longer treated as something that could be sacrificed repeatedly in pursuit of short-term employment gains. Governments granted central banks greater operational independence. Policymakers paid closer attention to expectations and credibility. Eventually, institutions such as the Federal Reserve adopted a longer-run inflation objective of 2%. This did not mean prices would stop rising. It meant the rise would be slow and predictable enough that households and businesses could make contracts without constantly preparing for monetary disorder. A small positive target also provided distance from deflation, when falling prices can increase the real burden of debt and encourage people to postpone spending. This answers the question hidden inside every modern price tag. When inflation falls from 10% to 2%, prices do not return to where they began. They continue rising, only more slowly. Central banks generally aim to stabilize the rate of change, not reverse the accumulated increase. Returning the entire price level to an earlier point would require deflation or a prolonged period of unusually low inflation. That process could increase real debts, reduce wages and profits, and produce unemployment. The historical memory of depression makes policymakers reluctant to impose that adjustment merely to restore yesterday's numbers. Modern monetary stability is therefore a managed compromise. Savers receive money that gradually loses purchasing power. Debtors repay obligations in slightly cheaper units, and central banks attempt to keep the transfer predictable enough that it does not destroy trust. The Roman Mint, the Silver Mountain, the revolutionary printing press, the Reichsbank, and the modern central bank appear to belong to different worlds. Yet each confronted the same political problem. States and financial systems created claims on resources faster than production could always satisfy them. War debt employment promises shortages and political survival made restraint difficult. Prices became the mechanism through which the imbalance was distributed. Inflation was never only about money, it was about who received new purchasing power first, whose income adjusted last, whose debt became easier to repay, and whose savings absorbed the loss. The supermarket price tag is the final document in that long history. Its number records not only the cost of a product, but centuries of decisions about crisis credibility, production, and power. If this documentary changed how you understand inflation, subscribe and like the video, and tell us in the comments which force matters most in sustained inflation: money creation, supply shortages, government debt, or public expectations.